What do controversial NFTs, ownership scandals, and a class action lawsuit have in common? Stick around and let's talk about it. Hey guys, I'm Sprague, and if there's one coin that has been embroiled in infamy pretty much since the first time its name was mentioned, it's Tezos. However, after alienating its initial investors, a ton of infighting within its management, and pushing back its launch date multiple times, it might actually be a testament to what Tezos is that it still holds a position in the top 50 biggest coins. Initially conceptualized by Arthur Brightman, a computer scientist with a background in mathematics and finance, and his wife, Kathleen Brightman, the initial concept for Tezos was created as a response to Bitcoin back in 2014. Not unlike a lot of other coins and white papers that appeared around that time, the main sticking point for the Brightmans was Bitcoin's inability to scale. However, they also took issue with the fact that most chains around that time had no built-in democracy and had to be forked if there was a disagreement in the community. This was then fleshed out over the coming years until eventually investors saw their first glimpse of the actual Tezos token in the form of an ICO in 2017. This ICO went on to be the largest ICO ever recorded up until Filecoin recently overtook it, gaining $228 million of investment. To hold this ICO, first the Tezos Foundation was set up as a Swiss company under the directorship of Johann Gevers, with the goal of the ICO being to raise enough money to purchase the Tezos intellectual property from DLS, Arthur Brightman's company. Unfortunately, this is where the ownership struggle and infighting begins. The relationship between the Brightmans and Gevers broke down almost immediately, with the Brightmans taking some issue with some of the staff that Gevers wanted to hire, and the Brightmans withholding any of the online resources that should have been released to the Tezos Foundation. As a result of this, the Brightmans didn't hold up their end of the contract that stated that they had to give the Tezos chain and its intellectual property to the Tezos Foundation until Gevers was removed as a director. This then had the knock-on effect that they couldn't release the tokens to those initial investors because it was still being held by DLS, an American company, and therefore the Tezos token would have been classified as an American security. This is where the class action lawsuit was formulated, as a lot of the initial investors started to feel like they had invested in something that was just never going to come to market due to all of this infighting and the company falling apart from within. And the company absolutely was falling apart from within, with the Brightmans making very inflammatory statements towards Gevers and saying that he was just self-serving and wanted a money printer and therefore refusing to release the Tezos IP, and Gevers claiming that actually this was all just an attempt at character assassination and that they wanted more control themselves. This all came to a head when Kathleen Brightman eventually just said she was going to go rogue and release the tokens to the investors regardless of the legal ramifications, which then prompted two board members, one of which was Gevers, to step down from the Tezos Foundation. However, despite this rocky start, the technology that actually powers Tezos is fairly promising, and if it wasn't for the internal power struggle that happened at the start, I'm sure this chain actually probably would be much higher in the rankings than it is now, because underneath everything, it's an extremely promising chain, and had it actually come out at the initial time it was going to, it would have been a pioneer for some of the techniques that it actually employed. For example, had Tezos released back in 2017, its consensus model would have been one of the first to actually use delegated proof of stake. Now, I know that I'm probably going to get some backlash for calling it delegated proof of stake, because they call it liquid proof of stake. However, at a protocol level, there is almost no difference, so just hear me out. Just like delegated proof of stake, there is two roles in Tezos' consensus mechanism, and that's the role of the delegator and the validator, or as they call them, bakers. The reason the Tezos Foundation say that liquid proof of stake differs from delegated proof of stake is that delegated proof of stake has a fixed number of block producers, whereas liquid proof of stake can have any number. There's two problems with this, however, and that is that number one, the decision to cap the number of validators that can be in the block producing set is just that, a decision. And on top of this, liquid proof of stake does actually technically have this same cap. It's just much higher at 30,000 bakers. With most chains using DPoS, the decision to cap their validation set fairly small is due to the fact that they know that a lot of the people on their network won't have the funds to be a validator and instead will delegate. With an incredibly large set of block producers, what this means is that people who are delegating their stake have to do far more research into who they're actually delegating their stake with to aid in decentralization. And then what happens if there's too many is that people just gravitate to the biggest ones because it's easiest. And this is something that is actually entirely echoed within Tezos, with the largest baker holding more than 5% of the staking power of the entire network, and the top 15 block producers having a majority stake in the network. In a capped block production set, there is incentive not to misbehave due to the fact that you will get kicked out of the block production set, and therefore will no longer receive rewards for being a validator. This is why Tezos works great in a perfect scenario where delegators are quick to move their funds from misbehaving bakers. However, a lot of these people will just be delegating their funds and then leaving it and forgetting about it and letting the rewards accrue. This means there's less disincentivization for bakers to misbehave, because in reality, other than their stake getting slashed if they're caught, there's not really going to be any long-term damage to them, because they'll continue being a validator and they'll most likely retain most of the delegation they've had. In terms of actually becoming a baker, you need 8,000 XTZ, the Tezos token. Now, this is actually a lot lower than a lot of other networks, but still comes to about $32,000. However, when you compare it to something like Ethereum, this is about half the cost it would be to start up a new ETH 2.0 node. I think the biggest benefit for the Tezos consensus mechanism, however, is the ease at which it is to delegate. You pretty much just choose who you want to delegate your funds to, and there's no locking or bonding. You don't even send them to a contract. They stay within your wallet and are readily accessible if you need them, and I think this lowers the bar of entry required to have people participate in consensus. But as I mentioned, one of the biggest things the Brightmans identified as a problem within Bitcoin was the fact that there's no on-chain democracy. And this is where I actually think Tezos was way ahead of the pack when it comes to on-chain governance. With most chains, when there's a disagreement on the network, you could end up with a hard fork, which is where a subsection of the community decide to change the node software in a way that makes it no longer compatible with the main node software and split off into their own fork of the chain. This means they share a history, but they have split and distinct futures. For example, Bitcoin Cash was a hard fork from Bitcoin, where a subsection of the community weren't happy with the direction that the chain was going in, and therefore decided to take the entire history of Bitcoin but continue on their own path, changing part of the protocol. It's incredibly confusing for newer investors, as both chains have continued to call themselves the true vision of what Satoshi wanted. The protocol that the developers of Tezos put in place, however, is one that allows developers to submit their code changes to the chain to be voted on by the holders. The way that this works is by having a proposer or baker submit source code to the chain to be voted on. Then it goes through a first round of voting where all of the proposals that are being made are all voted on independently. The proposal that has the most votes out of this pool of votes will then go on to be voted on by the majority of the network. If a supermajority of 80% of the network agree with this proposal, it will then go into a testing stage. This testing happens on a parallel chain that allows them to see what the repercussions and ramifications of implementing this proposal would have. Once this has been done, the network then re-votes on the proposal with the new data that they've acquired from running it in testing mode, and if it passes this, it will then be implemented into the chain. This system means that any developer can submit a change to the protocol and feel like their voice is being heard, while also, if their proposal doesn't get chosen, know that it's because they were the minority. However, I'm going to cover in my concern section at the end that I'm not sure that this will actually end up playing out how they expect it to. With such a strong consensus mechanism and the fact that they have built-in governance into the chain right from the get-go, the thing that's going to really make or break Tezos is adoption. Now, in terms of adoption, on the NFT front, they're actually doing incredibly well, getting a partnership with Ubisoft for their new line of gaming NFTs. Ubisoft currently holds the position of the 20th highest grossing company by game sales in the world. This means that an incredibly large audience is not only going to be exposed to crypto, but Tezos in particular. This unfortunately, however, does have a small caveat though, which is that if you step out of the crypto realm for a moment and you start talking to normal people, they genuinely hate NFTs and crypto. And this is echoed within the fact that by the end of last year, Ubisoft had sold a total of 15 NFTs for a paltry $700. However, I do feel that this is a relatively short-term problem. While the media and crypto bros are constantly shoving their new NFT collections or their new shitcoins down people's throats, there's always going to be negative sentiment in the mainstream towards crypto. This is echoed in the fact that r/Buttcoin, an anti-crypto sub, pumped nearly as much as the market did through 2020 to now. growing from 40,000 subscribers to nearly 100,000. This means that until this get-rich-quick mentality that seems to be surrounding NFTs at the moment dies out, there's always going to be negative sentiment towards the broaching of NFTs in any mainstream activity such as gaming. However, I do think that once this mentality starts to fade and people start to realize that crypto isn't as bad as people expect, and that not all of us are like that guy on Twitter who's constantly shoving his new NFT project down people's throats, that actually this will be a major boon to Tezos having such a huge game publisher on their network. This is also major in the fact that one of the biggest ways to attract new business is to have big business already on your platform. By having Ubisoft, chances are that they will entice other game manufacturers to also join the Tezos network because they tend to just follow suit with what each other are doing. Unfortunately, however, the same successes are not being felt in the DeFi area of Tezos, with only $83 million worth of TVL. This is fairly abysmal, especially when you consider that nearly 48% of that is held by a single contract called UVs, which is a contract that provides synthetic assets on the Tezos network. It's not all bad news, and there is people who are currently building contracts on Tezos. However, most of these have not been launched yet, and only time will tell whether or not they will actually gain any market dominance. In terms of token supply and distribution, Tezos is actually probably one of the most fair distributions I've covered. A numeric measure of how fairly wealth is distributed is the Gini coefficient, where a value of 0 means every holder has an exactly equal amount of tokens, and where a value of 1 means that a single person holds the entire supply. This metric, like most where you try and boil down a complex network into a single figure, does have its flaws, but it's at least a good starting point. If you take all of the wallets in the Tezos network into account, you end up with a Gini coefficient of less than 0.25. Now, to put this in perspective, Ethereum and the United States both have a Gini coefficient of over 0.8. This obviously doesn't account for single holders who have multiple wallets and could be spreading their wealth across them, but in general this is a fairly fair metric to use. There is, however, a small black mark that I'm going to give Tezos on its initial distribution. Now, initially, the way that it was meant to work is that there would be 152 million Tezos tokens being distributed equally between DLS, Arthur Brightman's company, and the Tezos Foundation. To begin with, these tokens were held by the Tezos Foundation, with the goal being that they were going to be released to DLS over time. However, the Tezos Foundation actually used these locked tokens that were meant to go to DLS to stake with, which meant that they took a lot of the rewards that should have gone to independent bakers, meaning that instead of the 60 million Tezos tokens that DLS was meant to receive, they actually ended up receiving 78 million. This effectively means that using funds that the community presumed were locked by the Tezos Foundation, they actually profited an extra $54 million in tokens that should have been given out to the community. And also means that what they stated as being their initial token distribution is actually somewhat skewed by the fact they were gaming the system themselves. Now, as a potential price upside, it makes sense just to compare it to the chain that they are trying to compete with, which is Ethereum. And if you take the market cap of Ethereum and apply it to Tezos, you will end up with a price of $379, or a 104 times increase from the current price of one Tezos token. But I do have some concerns for Tezos, and the first is their self-amending protocol. My concern, however, isn't actually with the implementation. I think giving developers the ability to submit their code changes to the chain and have it be voted on is extremely clever, and I think a great benefit to the chain as a whole. My concern is actually with hard forking, and the fact I think this system might actually encourage it rather than dissuade it. Getting a supermajority of 80% over a minor change shouldn't be too much of an issue, and even some bigger changes that are widely agreed on by the network should be fairly easy to pass. However, if we use Bitcoin SegWit as an example, the majority of the chain agreed that SegWit was the correct way forwards. It was the minority that actually ended up forking and starting Bitcoin Cash. The detractors of SegWit didn't necessarily think that SegWit itself was the issue, they just didn't want SegWit to pass because they thought that it would push back increasing the block size, another proposal that was currently being pushed through the works. There is nothing stopping this exact scenario from actually happening with Tezos. It would just happen on-chain instead. The other problem with such a high supermajority is that if a major vote got 79% favor, but 21% decided they didn't want it, this would mean that actually the majority of the network would want that change, which would cause massive dissent within the community and potentially even cause a hard fork, because most of them would want to implement this change. This is obviously hypothetical, and I could be wrong here, and it might just be the case that these votes do actually cause people to think, okay, it's fine, I'm in the minority. But I think having the supermajority bar set so high means that there's actually going to be a large majority of people who might want a change, but a small number of people who just don't want any change, blocking it every single time. My second concern is with the Brightmans, and more specifically with Arthur Brightman having any sort of control over Tezos. Regardless of what side of the argument you were on with the Gevers situation, the fact of the matter is it was the Brightmans who broke the contract and refused to hand over the Tezos intellectual property. This was at the detriment of all of the investors, and they tried to play it off like their hands were tied and there was nothing they could do, when in reality, they had full control over the entire situation. They then used the dissent within the community as a weapon against Gevers, trying to force him out, even though really the community probably should have been somewhere in the middle along the whole thing, because at the end of the day, regardless of what the internal power struggle was, it was the Brightmans' decision not to release the intellectual property. When the foundation is so pivotal to gaining adoption and driving the chain forwards, it doesn't seem right to me having a board member who has already proven that they are self-serving in the fact they're willing to harm Tezos to get their own way. On top of this, the way that Arthur responds to people on Reddit is militant, even if the thing being asked is just a benign question, usually opting to belittle the person asking the question rather than acting even remotely professional. At the end of the day, this is obviously my opinion. I just don't like the fact that he's proven himself to be incredibly self-serving, but still on the board of the Tezos Foundation, the foundation that will inevitably make or break Tezos. And lastly, my final concern is just that despite being open source, most of the development on the Tezos chain is done by a single for-profit company, Nomadic Labs, that brings in $17 million worth of revenue every year. When you look at the contributors for Tezos, the top 15 are all employed by Nomadic Labs. Now obviously this isn't a concern from a security point of view because the code is all open source, so if any of them did anything that was potentially harmful to the network, other people would be able to pick up on it and stop it. The big problem, however, is that if Nomadic Labs were to go bust, 95% of Tezos' weekly development activity would just die off, which would mean the development would grind to a halt. So while yes, Tezos is technically open source, the development community is actually fairly centralized, with very, very few independent developers actually getting involved in the chain. But all in all, I think that Tezos is actually an extremely promising project, and I think that the way that they've actually approached their protocol design is incredibly clever. But there is definitely some things that need to be ironed out, namely in the way of adoption, that are going to really need to be done before it's going to gain any mainstream attention. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, leave me a like down below or a comment if you disagree with anything I've said. And if you just want to see more content like this in the future, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Thanks. Bye.